In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this Dia De Los Muertos granny square afghan. It's made up of two different types of granny squares. The first of these is just this floral pattern. You start by using a 5mm crochet hook and worsted weight yarn, and we're going to make a magic circle, which usually takes me a couple of times to get right. Once we have our magic circle, we're going to put 16 double crochets into this. Now I like to start, instead of starting with a chain, I like to start with a standing double crochet. And if you don't know how to do this, I will link a video showing you how in the comments below or in the description below. But we do our standing double crochet, and then 15 more double crochets right into the magic circle. And then once we have our 16 double crochets, we tighten the magic circle and then slip stitch into that first standing double crochet. And there we have our first round completed, which is the center of our floral motif. So the next round of this square, we're going to start creating some petal shapes around the center of this flower. These are worked into the top of the double crochet, so you just select any of the double crochets and then attach your new color of yarn with a slip stitch through the top of that double crochet. What we're going to do are, these are called puff stitches, so they're kind of similar to starting a double crochet. So you're going to yarn over as if you're doing a double crochet, and then insert your hook and pull up another loop. But then instead of finishing off the double crochet, you'll go ahead and yarn over again, insert your hook again, pull up another loop, and you'll do this 3 times. So this will give you a total of 7 loops on your hook. And then once you have the 7 loops, you yarn over, pull through, then chain 1 to lock it in place. We'll slow down here. Let's yarn over, insert the hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert the hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert the hook, pull up a loop, and then pull through all those loops. Chain 1 to lock it in place. So you just continue this until you've made it all the way around, which you'll have 16 puff stitches if you do this. And then you will just slip stitch into the first puff stitch once you make it all the way around to the beginning. And then you bind off, and you have completed your second round. So for the third round, we're actually going to work into the chain 1 spaces that we created in the previous round. So just insert your hook into one of those spaces, and then attach your new color of yarn with a slip stitch. And then we're going to create some larger petal shapes of the flower. For this one, I like to pull my yarn out a little bit and make that first loop a little bigger. And we're going to do kind of partial double crochets. We'll yarn over, pull up a loop, and then pull through the first 2 loops. Then yarn over, go back into the same hole, pull up a loop, pull through the first 2 loops. Yarn over, into the hole, yarn over and pull up through the first 2 loops. And once you've done that 4 times, you'll have 5 loops on your hook, and then you pull over and pull through all 5 of those loops. And then you chain 2 to lock it down, and then you'll just complete that, the 4 large puff stitches into each of the chain 1 spaces until you have 16 of them, and then slip stitch into the very first one of the round. bind off, and your third round is complete. For this next round, we're going to start working into the chain 2 spaces, and this is where we're going to turn this round project into a square. So attach your new color of yarn with a slip stitch, and then chain 3. This is going to count as a triple crochet here. Then you're going to put 2 more triple crochets right into this same space. So there'll be a total of 3 triple crochets counting that initial chain. Then in the next chain 2 space, we're going to put double crochets. So you just place 3 double crochets into the same chain space. Then in the next chain space, we're going to put 3 half double crochets. And those half double crochets mark the center of one of the sides of our square. So that's the center. We're now going to start working in reverse of what we've done before. So the next one is going to be 3 double crochets. We're going to go back in the same pattern that we came to the center here. So then in our next space, we're going to put 3 triple crochets. There's 1, 2, and 3. And this creates one whole side of our granny square. So now we need to turn the corner and go down the next side. So to do that, we're going to chain 3, and then we're going to put 3 more triple crochets in that same space that we did the last 3. So there's 1 triple crochet, and there's 2, and 3. So now we've turned the corner and we're starting down the next side. So that counted as our first section of triple crochets, so then in our next space we're going to put 3 double crochets. So there's 1, 2, and 3 double crochets. So then our next space is 3 half double crochets. And then our next one is going to be 3 double crochets again. And then 3 triple crochets. And then you'll just repeat this all the way around. You'll do your chain 3 again to turn the corner, and then 3 more double crochets, and then or 3 more triple crochets, and then 3 double crochets, and then 3 half double crochets, and continue that same pattern all the way around until you're back to the beginning of your square. So once you get to the end of your final side, you'll notice we have 3 triple crochets in that corner already. So we'll put our final 3 triple crochets into that same corner space there. And then before we slip stitch and bind off, we can't forget our chain 3 that goes in between these sections of triple crochets. So we'll do our chain 3, and then we slip stitch into that first triple crochet. And then you just bind off, and your first square is complete. So your second type of square for this blanket are these skull granny squares. So we start with the skull motif first. So we're going to do a magic circle here. And then I'm going to start with a standing double crochet again. And then once you have that, you will chain one, and then do another double crochet, and then chain one, and you'll do a total of 7 double crochets, and then a chain one, and then one more final double crochet into that magic circle. So you end up with 8 double crochets and 7 chain one spaces. So the next thing we're going to do is chain 3, and then back into the magic circle to do another double crochet. And then chain 2, and then another double crochet. And then you'll go ahead and tighten your magic circle. And then chain 3. And then slip stitch into that first double crochet. And there's the beginnings of your skull. That's the first round. So for the second round, we're going to work into the chain 1 spaces in between these double crochets. And you are going to put 2 half double crochets into each chain 1 space. So there are 7 spaces, so you end up with 14 half double crochets. Alright, once you have those, then you're going to build what will essentially be like the eye socket slash cheek of the skull. So this chain 3 space we have here, we're going to put 7 single crochets into this chain space. And then you're going to slip stitch into the chain 2 space that we have here. So just slip stitch, and then chain 3. And then put 2 double crochets into that same chain 2 space. And then chain 3. And then slip stitch into that chain 2 space again. And this creates like the jawbone of the skull. So then we're back to our second chain 3 space here, so we're going to put 7 single crochets into that chain 3 space. And then once you've done that, you just slip stitch into that first half double crochet. Then bind off, because that completes the skull motif of this granny square. So for our next round of this square, we notice that this skull basically is the same size as the first 2 rounds of the flower granny square. So we're just going to add 2 more rounds to make it the same size as the other. So we'll start with our large flower petal puffs. So we'll just join this with a slip stitch. Now, your skull is kind of, imagine it in like 4 quadrants, as though it's 4 distinct areas. We need to get 16 petals around this entire skull. So we're going to try to fit 4 petals into each quadrant around the skull. Alright. So we're going to join kind of at the beginning of one of those quadrants, so that the middle of these petals will end at the middle of the skull, because we want the skull to be kind of centered. Now we're not going to go through the stitch the way we normally would. We're going to go through this back loop, which is behind the 2 V's there. So attach into that back loop, and then we're going to just work our large puffs, which, remember, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then draw through the first 2 loops, and then yarn over, pull up a loop, and then draw through the first 2 loops, and do that 4 times until we get 5 loops on our hook. And then you'll draw through all 5 loops to get your large puff stitch. So we see here it's not attached through the stitches you normally would, it's attached kind of behind those stitches by going through this back loop. So you'll just do that until you've got your full 4 in your quadrant, and you'll make sure that that 4th petal kind of ends right at the center of the top of that skull. You'll start your 2nd quadrant from the center of the top of the skull down to the side, and it kind of ends in the same general area that the other one kind of started. So for our 3rd quadrant, we're going to fit 4 in here. The first 2, we're going to kind of go into the cheek of this skull here. So you put the first one there at the beginning of the cheek, right next to the eye. You'll put your chain 2 space, and then the next one will go in kind of next to that. And then the 3rd one is going to go into that slip stitch that's between the jawbone and the eye socket. So we need to elongate this a little bit, so when we start this puff stitch, we're going to double wrap as though we're doing a triple crochet at first, and then continue your puff stitch with the double crochet as you would. And you see it kind of elongates a little bit and fills in that space where it's kind of indented from the side of the jaw. Then your final one of that quadrant will go into the bottom of that mouth of the skull. And remember to always be working into those back loops. That's the 3rd quadrant. So the 4th one just starts right next to that one on the bottom of the jaw there. We'll just put our next puff stitch right into that. And then our 2nd puff stitch is going to go into that slip stitch on the next side of the jaw. And so we have to do our double wrap as though we're doing a triple crochet at first. And then into that slip stitch. And then just continue your large puff stitch as normal. And then your last 2 puff stitches for that quadrant are going to go into the cheek of the other side here. So here's our first one. And it can be a little tough to get these stitches into, particularly the stitches on the cheek eye socket area. Those seem to be a little tighter than the rest of them. So these puff stitches are worked exactly the same way as the puff stitches from the floral motif, except we're going into those back loops around the skull. And once we've got our last one of that 4th quadrant, we just slip stitch, do our chain 2 in between, and then slip stitch into that first puff stitch that we created. And that's that next round of the skull motif. So then our next round, or the final round of this, is we're going to be working into the chain 2 spaces again, just like we did for the floral motif. But we want to make sure that we're getting this centered, so we're going to find the section that is above the center of the top of the skull. That will be where our half double crochets go. And then we'll count back the double crochet and then the triple crochet to know where we will start. So we join our yarn, we do a chain 3 and then 2 triple crochets into that same space. And then 3 double crochets into the next space. And then we're going to pay close attention and make sure that these half double crochets are going into the chain 2 space that's directly above the center of the skull. So we make sure that that skull motif stays straight within our granny square. So we got our half double crochets, then we work double crochets into the next. And then triple crochets, and then we work the same way we did on the floral motif. So we get to the corner, we do our triple crochets, chain 3, and then triple crochets into the same spot, and continue on around, continuing this until we actually have a square shape. And that's basically the skull granny's crown. Now the next few steps I'm going to show you are kind of optional, but I liked them to kind of dress the skull up a little bit. What I did was I just attached yarn through the back loop of the actual white skull part here. You'll see there's stitches going around the edge of the skull. I just went through, like down through the top of this stitch, through that back loop, and just did slip stitches all the way around to kind of do a slip stitch border. I thought it just kind of framed the skull a little bit and made it stand out. So you just slip stitch all the way around, and then slip stitch to the final one when you get there, and then bind off, and then of course you have a lot of ends to weave in on this blanket. Here we see it kind of gives a little border to the skull itself. The next optional part is I added some little roses to the corner of each of these skull granny squares. So I started with some leaves. I used a smaller hook here. I used a 3.5mm hook. And you just start with a slip knot and chain 12. And then we're going to go into the second chain from the hook, do a single crochet, then a half double crochet into the next chain, then a double crochet into the next one, then back down a half double crochet, and then a single crochet. That gives the first half of the leaf, and then we're just going to slip stitch into that next chain. And then we're going to repeat this process. We'll start with a single crochet into the next one, and then a half double crochet, then a double crochet, and then half double crochet again. And then in our final chain, we'll do a single crochet. And then we just bind off. And this will create the leaves of the little roses that I put in the corner. So you create 4 of these for each of the granny squares. And they'll just be stitched on like this into the corner to create the leaves. But as I said, for each of these skull granny squares, you'll do 1 set of leaves for each corner, so there'll be 4 per square. So for the rows, using the same size hook again and worsted weight yarn, I just did a slip knot and a chain of 6. And then in the second chain from the hook, we're going to start by putting 2 single crochets into that chain. Then in the next chain, we'll do 2 half double crochets. And then in the next one, we'll do 2 double crochets. And then we will work our way back down. We'll do 2 half double crochets. And then 2 single crochets into the final chain. And then when you bind this off, you'll notice it kind of wants to curl up on itself. So that's what we're wanting. It'll roll up, and then we stitch this, kind of creates a little rosebud. And once again, you'll have to create 4 of these for each of the skull granny squares. And they'll just be stitched on top of the leaves, just like this. To create my blanket, I did 4 rows of skulls and 5 rows of flowers with 7 squares per row. So once you have all of your squares completed, it's time to stitch them together. So you'll take 2 squares in whatever pattern you want and place them wrong sides together. And then I used black yarn. You can use whatever color yarn you want and your 5mm crochet hook. And we're going to put these together with single crochets. So starting with the middle chain of one of the corners where you have the 3 chain corner, go into the middle chain of each of those. Join your yarn. I just join with a slip stitch. And once you get your yarn joined, you'll just put a single crochet into those same stitches again. So back into them and single crochet. And then you'll single crochet through the next chain of each of those squares. And then once you get to the actual double and triple crochets where you actually have a stitch to go into, instead of going through the entire stitch, you're going to go through just 1 loop of each stitch. So you see you have the 2 loops there. We're going to go through the back loop of one and the front loop of the next one. And then just single crochet through those together. We'll do that again through 1 loop of each square here and single crochet. And you just continue doing this all the way down the square until you have both squares attached together with a row of single crochets. And once you get to the end of the row, you just bind off. And then once you have all of your squares crocheted into a row, you can then crochet your rows together using the same method. So we see we have our squares put together. We'll just keep adding squares until we have a row long enough, and then we'll put the rows together and crochet those together with a row of single crochets across the top and bottom as well. So here we have all of our squares and rows stitched together. And then I put a border on mine as well. So to do the border, I just did single crochets all around the perimeter of the blanket. The tricky thing is when you get to a corner, in order to turn the corner, you'll put 3 single crochets into the same stitch at the corner, and that will help you turn that 90 degrees to make the mitered corner here and come on around. This blanket ended up being around 42 inches by 50 inches, so it's a nice enough size to use as like a lap blanket while you're watching TV or something. So there you go. There is your Dia De Los Muertos inspired lap blanket.